Hey, it's Phil, and welcome on the Habit Bootcamps podcast, where I interview entrepreneurs and coaches about their mindset shifts and habits. In this episode, I interview Luke Green, who is a peak performance coach, and he helps students with getting better grades, learning faster, and studying better. In this podcast, we talked about how to get better grades, the future of education, how to be motivated when studying, how to nourish your brain, the problems boys have in schools nowadays, and some tips on how to study better. So let me know what lesson you've learned from this week's episode by dropping a comment below and enjoy this week's podcast. Hey Luke, welcome on the podcast, man.
Hi, Filip. Good to see you.
How are you doing at the moment?
Yeah, excellent. I'm really good. Just back from Berlin, nicely fresh. Got a couple of weeks off, so I'm really good. Really good.
How would you introduce yourself to my audience?
So I suppose you could say a peak performance coach or mindset coach, but specifically for students, and sort of engineering peak state for learning, essentially. So peak learning states is the name of my business, and that's what I do.
When was the first time you became interested in this topic?
I think for me, growing up, my mother was a nurse, so there's always this inherent kind of interest in health, or perhaps I'd assimilated some of her anxieties around health. So I started to really take on board sort of fitness from a young age. I invested in gym, and I had a gym whilst I was at university in Plymouth. So for me, the difference between those who can and those who can't has always really fascinated me. So kind of that's where it all sort of started, really. The mindset, I suppose the athletic mindset also, and just that really positive growth mindset was always something that interested me.
What was the moment when you transformed the can't into a can? Was there a specific moment in your life that you said, like, I always thought I couldn't do this, but I'm going to go for this?
I suppose there's two, really. There's one, when I was coaching in the CrossFit gyms, there was always you would always have people who would not be able to lift a certain weight because of the numbers, because of what it represented to them. And actually, something that we would do without even telling them is when they're going for a big weight, we'd actually put a couple of extra kilos on there, just so that they would be kind of pushing those boundaries. And that lesson, like kind of very quickly, resounded with me, it resonated with me, and it just meant, well, actually, it's the mindset that you have. Actually, you can push through those limitations. If you take away the numbers and what you have, and you just put the effort in anyway, then you're going to get what you want out of it, probably even more so. And when I went back to university, I was on track for maybe a low 2-1, so maybe about 60%. And I spoke to someone, I had a kind of a coaching session, really, and they said, well, you're putting in the same amount of effort, that it takes to be worried and stressed, like you may as well raise your sights. So I said, right, I'm going to get a first class degree. And actually, I took away the notion of what 70% was required for a first class degree. And I just said, right, I'm going to put in everything I possibly can. And I smashed out of the park. I got some of the highest grades I've ever seen. And that was simply removing the beliefs, or removing those limiting beliefs, and having control of that, focusing on the outcome rather than that kind of objective point in reality.
Yeah, I remember when I was studying that I tried to do the amount that was needed just to pass. I never had any exams that I do again. And I think a lot of students will resonate with this, that they study like something for a year, 2 years, and then they're not really motivated enough because they feel like, yeah, I'm in for 2 years, so I might as well just finish, but they don't have like that drive to actually end up with a very high degree. Why do you think that happens, or that they lose the motivation to actually push themselves to have like really high grades?
Because I don't think they're actually motivated. They're not actually motivated by the work or the effort or the transformation which takes place through putting in hard work. They're more motivated by the status of that classification. Gary Vaynerchuk was doing something the other day. He was saying, how many of you got a business degree? Or everyone sticks their hands up, and he's like, how many of you still read a book week, and like, everyone's hands goes down. And actually, it's very rare that you get people who are inherently motivated by that transformation, because it's hard work and it's hard work to sustain. So yeah, I think that's why.
Yeah, for instance, for me, I was motivated that it could change something or I could put something of myself into that education. But then the vision I had of that education was not really living up to it. It ended up becoming more about memorizing. And I was like, am I actually going to do something with this? And then it didn't become like something that could help me do my passion, but it was just like, oh, okay, I have this piece of paper that I can maybe do
Yeah.
something with.
I think the process of education, in terms of, it's almost like a safe space where you can find out what it takes. You can make those mistakes. You can get that feedback. You can find out what it takes to really achieve X, Y, Z. And fundamentally, if if you are performing at the best of your ability, or if you learn how to do that within that environment, then you can apply that to anything. I think the skills of research, and this, actually the skills of learning generally, if you're a fantastic learner, then if you can find the motivation in whatever path it is that you really want to do, then you're gonna do outstanding. You're gonna do really, really well. And actually, I think there's a lot to be gained from studying in a disciplined way. I think the discipline of academia is actually so important. The consistency, actually creating a habit out of learning, managing distractions in your time. Like, fundamentally, you're building a body of knowledge, or you're learning how to build a body of knowledge that in any context is going to be so important. So, we could argue that a lot of courses, for example, don't necessarily have a value because of the way in which they're taught, and you've got the lag between that knowledge and applying it, and it's not applied learning, and so on and so forth. However, there are things out there which are particularly important. Not just that, but if you foster a love of learning, and if it really enhance your ability to learn, and you go away and you apply that to something that becomes more meaningful, then I think you've done yourself the best thing possible there.
Yeah, one of the things that was useful was to push through and learn things that I was not interested in, but did it anyway, because you also have something that's a part of what you need to learn, and you can't just only learn what you find pleasurable. And it depends on what kind of education you follow. I think if it's very practical, that's like great educations, or you can't just be a doctor by reading books. But a type like me, who's like more structural and analytical, I didn't really need education to actually structure things and have that love of learning, because I had that curiosity. But I think for a lot of people, as you mentioned, to have that structure of the courses, waking up at a certain time, exams, structuring, learning how to digest material, that can be a fantastic skill, even besides the education that you study for later learning. That if you learn how to structure things and learn it in a certain way, then it's easier than when you have to manage it all by yourself.
Yeah, I also think that I mean, I don't know whether you're anything like me. I went to Bristol University as one of the top 10 universities in the UK. They a lot of their lecturers challenged me intellectually to the point that they allowed me to think in a completely different way, and that, more than anything, was also the value of that experience. Having great scholars, mentors academically, that pushed me to beyond what I thought was possible. That was extremely valuable. As with any business, as with anything, if you have a mentor, if you have someone that brings you across that comfort zone, and allows you to make that transition, then that's where you get your value from.
Well, you look now as a peak performance coach at the ways education is organized and how students digest study material. What are some of the things you really like about the current education system, and what are some things that you would like to change or adapt?
So what I like at the moment is that with the recent changes, things becoming more difficult. Actually, the education system has opened this idea that there is a growth mindset, and actually it is more about empowering learners and creating resilient learners. So that I'm definitely very happy with. Um, I actually think there's a lack of expertise within education, particularly with regards to the brain. I mean, you can teach, and your teaching course doesn't necessarily teach you or help you kind of to understand that any better. And I also think that within the private sector, so within big business, I think there's a lot of peak performance and things which takes place there, which actually, if we refocus that into, the earlier stages of education, I think that would have such a big impact, sort of long term. But because in England, the public sector, there's not enough money in there, we see a lot of teachers fleeing there for the private sector. We don't see that many people staying there. There's no inherent value. It doesn't motivate people monetarily. There's a lot of work needs to be done there. So there's some issues there that mean that energy is moved elsewhere.
Yeah, I believe that for certain courses, there's less exposure to a competitive market in an education system because they have tenure and they have their courses sometimes that they give like for 10 years. And it's not a rating system or with customers that they say, I'm going to choose the best education. No, it's that education. And they get paid and they have their salary and they're so busy teaching that they're not like actually in the market, which is already ahead of them and is pretty much more flexible. So for some jobs, there's actually a lot more learning and a lot more adaptation to a constant expanding society than that narrow, not innovative structure of universities. Not everyone, but it's always a bit slower because there's less competitiveness within that field that they give an education about, be it marketing, copywriting, etc.
I think the key difference for me is that in the private sector, there's a value placed on time, whereas in the public sector, because you're fundamentally paid for the job that you do, there's no emphasis on the value of time. And actually, that's massively catching up with the public sector.
And I also had Jordan Peterson once talked about it, about also not only for the students, but also for the professors. Because if you know how to learn how to navigate the social media landscape and you can create courses and be on YouTube and you have 30,000 or 300,000 followers, you can be interactive, you can be dynamic, you can make more money than your fixed salary that you make at the university. So smart professors who are like expanding and connecting with students worldwide, they can teach 2,000, 2,000, 10,000 people. They can make more money, have more influence, and do more what they like and adapt to what people need and be in interactions with people. So even for them, it becomes more attractive, I think.
I completely agree. I find it really ironic that most teachers that go into the profession do so out of a willingness to have an impact on young people, which is, very pure motivation. They become great public speakers. They become great in terms of planning and teaching. And we know that we're in the knowledge economy, right? But, they potentially lack the marketing, as it were, to kind of enable that wider reach. And actually, there's something that really excites me. I think it's just, teachers, for me personally, having worked with them, have some of the most incredible mindsets, eternally resilient, can work some incredible hours, can endure massive stresses, emotionally very intelligent in a lot of cases. And they're in a very strong place to have a massive impact.
Yeah, because those people can speak in front of an audience, they can create courses, they can make exams, they can evaluate things. So if these are things even online when people create courses, or these are skills that are very valued, like if you are an engaging teacher before a class and you know how to answer questions and bring up interesting material. I mean, if you do that online, that's what actually people are looking for. Edutainment, right? The entertainment, but bring in education in an entertaining way. If you can combine those, that's what people are looking for. Because if you see certain lectures, I mean, Robert Sapolsky, his lectures about human behavior biology has been watched more than 1 million times, and it's just filmed with a camera for his class, but it's just so engaging.
Yeah, engagement is key. Engagement, that's kind of the alchemy index, really, of education. When you are engaged, you've got more dopamine flying around. That's what enables you to learn effectively, which is key, which is absolutely key.
What do you think will be the future of like education, or how will universities be able to adapt to the whole digital evolution of learning?
It's a really good question. I mean, we're seeing some backlash at the moment in the UK with, so the tuition fees went from like £3,000 a year up to £9,000 a year, and as a result, less students are going to universities. And actually, a lot of universities are offering more conservative offers. So people that perhaps wouldn't have got into a certain university are now having more conservative offers just because less people are applying, because of the financial dilemma they face. I think online is key. I think we're seeing a lot of universities that are pumping out really high quality online courses, really, really high quality courses. And actually with the likes of Udemy, for example, very cheap online courses, I don't actually think that you need to go to university in order to get an outstanding education. I think it's tough. It's hard to say. It's really, really hard to say. Education at the moment is in a bit of turmoil, really, because of the pace of change that we're seeing, and it's not flexible enough in order to be able to kind of deal with those things. So yeah, I think it's a tough call.
And if I would be an employee and I would have to choose with somebody who has like 6 degrees but don't know how to adapt, work for themselves, or be productive, or have somebody who actually wrote blog articles, digital marketing, created like funnels, knows how to work the Bitcoin technology, etc., and he could provide the results, show that he already done the work, I'm probably going to choose the second one because he can deliver the results. I don't have to train him or her, while that degree still seems important for some people to have just to be able to solicit for a job and apply for a job. But when somebody comes for me and he can provide the copywriting skills, I'm going to hire that dude because results speak for themselves.
Yeah, it's about capability. Like 9 times out of 10, if you can ensure that, well, if you've already done the work, if you've made the impact already, then that is the job. On paper, it's you've got someone who's doing the job already versus someone who could potentially do the job. So,
how were you able to motivate yourself during studying, and what were some of the methods, mentally or physically or routine wise, that you did to get in a good state?
It's a good question. I think having quite a good understanding of sort of health and fitness, and then the kind of the neurological basis of performance, that enabled me to perform. I used to pull some relatively insane hours for long periods of time and do pretty well. So I would use a lot of aerobic exercise. So I would go for like a moderate run for about 40 minutes. So nothing too stressful. And then I'd have a shower, have a bite to eat. Then I'd be in a peak state then just to get out some high quality work. I would also chunk things down. So I would do a lot of reading. I'd do a lot of reading because it's low energy, just reading some notes. I just think about things for a long time. And then when it came to writing, the writing was something that initially is quite taxing in terms of getting that kind of first mold down. So that was just a case of eating particularly well. I'd work for maybe an hour, a couple of hours at a time, and then go off, take a break, just allow things to think through. Like I wouldn't push myself any more than I needed to. I did what was enough, and would just be relentless with that. So I would just every day I'd be moving myself closer and closer and closer. I had relatively strict sort of time frames and things which I'd adhere to as best as I possibly could. So that was kind of like motivation in a short-term literal sense, but then you've got like that long-term motivation, keeping that vision in place. Like I wanted a first-class degree, but why did I want one? I saw myself getting that first-class degree. I saw the life that I'd potentially be able to have as a result of making that transformation take place. And I had a vision board essentially. I revisited that every day. I basically created a habit out of being motivated. So I was revisiting that every day, essentially created the belief that I was going to get a first class degree. There was no question about it. I was going to achieve that. And then as a result, everything else changed. So it was revisiting that on a daily basis that created the habit of that belief that allowed me to perform.
Yeah, it's also what some research shows, that if you can make a connection with your future self and you can see that you can make it, not the question of when and not if, then you see like, okay, what I do now is connected with my future self, and it's almost like your future self is your biggest supporter and motivating you, because like I'm gonna get it. While other people, they think of their future self, and in their brain the part is activated of a stranger. It's almost like they think of someone else who they don't believe they can be.
Yeah, Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think the key thing is if you can see yourself in that situation, if you can see yourself doing that, then it's already done. Well, that it's not already done, but I think like at least half the battle really. If you can't see yourself in that position, if you can't see yourself in that situation, then that's where the difficulty comes. And particularly with motivating yourself, because your central nervous system isn't going to fire up. You aren't actually going to be able to engage with things emotionally in order to be able to achieve at that level. So that vision is the most important thing.
Also, you worked with CrossFit and fitness and movement, and something I also still found strange, especially as a productivity coach myself, is that most work like 9 to 5, or most students, it's just like we give classes after each other, 3 hours, 4 hours, and people will be able to have that attention, willpower, focus, and energy. But I mean, even when I studied, if you work for an hour, 2 hours, 2 hours and a half, and then maybe you get rid of being static, or you move a bit, or you go to nature, or you take a break, and then again you get to work, you're a lot more productive than just looking at productivity quantity
Yeah.
wise. But it's still like, as long as you put in the hours, that's okay. How you do it and what the fluctuation and oscillation is between deep work and deep rest, that doesn't matter. But it's counterproductive, literally counterproductive.
Yeah, I always found that my best ideas came from taking a break and walking around and loosening things up, and then all of a sudden you get that eureka moment about whatever it was that you're trying to make connections with. So I'm a big advocate of not just kind of like sitting there, procrastinating, allowing your mind to drift over something that is, completely not in line with what it is you're doing. Going off and doing, having a walk or a run or whatever would I'd always be thinking about things when I was going away from it. I don't know whether everyone has that, but
Talk a bit about how people can strengthen the connection with their future self, or visualize. You mentioned like a vision board. Could you explain people like how it works or what they could do?
yeah. So I was fortunate that I went away and did some NLP training, which is really good because we did a lot of timeline work and less sort of future timeline work. So it was always about that vision in the future. So not just so you've got an immediate vision of what that might look like, maybe over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. So constructing that longer timeline and rationalizing things was really, really important. So the vision board was ultimately things which you associated with your future self and things which you might, so not as a direct, so not so whilst I was aiming for a first class degree, it was okay. What might a job look like as a result of that? Thinking about that potential. What might my line of work be? What was my kind of sense of purpose? And that was really to have an impact on people. And what was what would my life look like? Is it the quality of my friends, the quality of my living environment, those sort of things emotionally are very, very engaging and actually very exciting. Then if you looked at the flip side of that, actually, if I carried on the way I am, if I didn't achieve at this level, what could that potentially look like? What is the cost of underachievement fundamentally? So that's kind of a long-term vision. And then that was really backed up by doing some of the work on through the NLP. So the timeline work. So at each interval, whether it's a year, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, for example, what does my life look like? How can I imagine myself living these experiences? And I think once you put yourself through that, you start to think, well, actually, it's entirely possible. Having references that were, I think I took a lot of solace in sort of like the likes of like Tony Robbins, for example, seeing guys that have, or just surrounding myself with this like transformative coaching and just seeing that the possibility was there was just really helped to enforce that this was all a massive possibility and it was all down to me about the choices that I made. So that was really, really key. Another thing, so in line with that, was the Dickens process as well. I don't know if that's something you've ever done. It's looking at your kind of habits. Tony Robbins is a fantastic example of how this works. I mean, he'd do it over a couple of hours, but you'd look at like you in the past, you in the present, and you in the future, and how your life was then, how it is now, and how it will be in the future. And ultimately, if you don't change, what does it look like? How does it impact people, not just yourself, but other people? How will it impact you in the future, essentially? how will it impact other people? And because it's across those 3 different time frames, there's no escaping those emotions. So you create this emotional contrast from the past into the future, which is so compelling that you have to go in that direction.
Yeah, when you look into the brain, it's almost like putting weights on that and training that prefrontal cortex, because that's responsible for willpower and impulse control. And impulse control is delaying gratification. And a lot of times we do things because we want to have instant gratification. But when that weight is bigger from, the things of gratification in a week, like I'm not going to make this decision because in a week I'm going to be more gratified by making this decision, or in a year or 2 years, you stop following your impulses and you actually make long-term decisions based on gratification, but longer, more weighty gratification. Yeah. And that way you train that prefrontal cortex and your impulse muscle and your self-control to relate it to visions or ideas or things, values that are more important than the present gratification of the moment that might not be beneficial to you in the future or in the past.
Yeah, and I think to back that up as well, I also looked very acutely at kind of where I had those sort of impulses, or what I was perhaps not exercising self-control over, and kind of really unpick those and kind of move those out the way, which meant that in exercising that self-control in kind of all that kind of holistic range of things, that massively benefited me sort of overall, really, because it's the same muscle essentially. So whether it was sugar, for example, or alcohol, for example, those things, moving those things out of the way, exercising self-control of those. I mean, I wouldn't touch a drop of alcohol for 6 weeks at a time, because it was more about the statement that I was making about that and the impact it was having on my discipline that allowed me to achieve those ultimate goals.
Well, I like to divide the things in 2 different aspects. Self-discipline, it's doing what you have to do. And self-control is not doing things that are detrimental for you. So saying no is more like the self-control, and picking up the weights or doing something good is actually self-discipline. And then you have more positive yeses and more positive saying no to things.
Yeah, I can see a massive parallel in that.
What's also interesting, and I thought about it recently, is like mindset. And we have the word set in it. And when we think of physical things, we think of sets and reps, right? But mind is also a bit like making a rep, like the more times you say no or say yes or do things or train your mind, it's also like a mindset and doing reps. And you can develop the strength of your mind, the endurance of your mind, the flexibility of your mind, the mobility of your mind. So it's less tangible than the physical things that you can see, you can stretch more, but it's also something we do repetitions every day, whether we like to or not.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, when I first started to exercise, that one thing that I found difficult was just doing something every day. When you're first starting off a habit and you're really trying to embed that, the immediate difficulties that you have are so great that it almost becomes off-putting. But it's like greasing a groove, like making a groove in something. Like the initially very, very difficult, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. I think going away and looking at the neuroscience of kind of neuroplasticity and how forming different neural connections, you are fundamentally initially forging connections in your brain, and that is quite a difficult process. And over time, as those connections just get stronger and stronger and stronger, the efficiency within those is increased, and therefore those activities become far, far easier in comparison. And through understanding that, I was able to justify the initial hard work, the almost impossibility of whatever it was, or that it seemed, that in the safe in the knowledge that over time, 4, 5, 6 weeks time, actually it's second nature, and you don't even have to think about it. It's effortless.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty stuff of how can we optimize our brain, or how can we start to develop a meaningful mindset?
To develop a meaningful mindset, fundamentally, I suppose define meaningful. For what purpose?
I'm talking about somebody who has a mindset that finds it difficult to change his or her circumstances and doesn't know where to start. You, as somebody who's into neurology, physiology, mindset, what are some things that people could practice or give them more leverage to start changing those things in their lives and their mindset?
So I think the first thing really is you need to interrupt the patterns which are taking place. So I would personally take a combined approach where you remove them from that environment if possible. So you're actually taking them out of the physical environment where you've got the impact of spatial psychology. So whenever you walk into a room, there are already subconscious patterns which are running, and particularly where work takes place. If you've got your computer in your bedroom, for example, and you've got your desk as well, the likelihood is that you're drawn to your computer because of the instant gratification, and that's just a pattern which will run because of the bias that you have towards that gratification rather than something which is long term. So re-establishing a certain place for that computer, for example, or re-establishing a certain place for that study is taking you out of that environment. It's removing that spatial psychology. Something as simple as turning your phone off, for example. You're removing those distractions, removing the external impact of that environment. Additionally, you need to pay close attention to your internal environment. So do you actually have the right conditions for motivation, as it were? So, if you are kind of slothing around watching TV, you're not particularly active, then actually you're never going to have that much inertia in the first instance. It's going to feel very, very difficult for you to do that. So nutrition and exercise play a massive, massive part in that. And then fundamentally also, you have to develop that sense of purpose. You need to be fired up by the long-term goal for what it is you're doing. And unless you have that flame, unless you have that why or that purpose, then it's no go. So none of these things are going to happen because there's no reason for you to do that. So it's kind of like there's a holistic approach to that, really, in terms of having the environment, having the internal environment, and having that psychological long-term vision of your future self. That kind of three-pronged approach starts things off, and it's a case of ensuring that you are moving forwards in the right direction.
Talk us a bit to the important neurons in our brain and what function they have, and what maybe are some tips on how people can improve their brain health.
Okay, so the key kind of learning mechanism in the brain, which I would say is most important, is dopamine, essentially, because that's responsible for executive function, and the kind of ultimately completing things, and you'll get up and go. To draw parallels between that and, say, cocaine, for example, you've got when people take cocaine, large amounts of dopamine is released. They become more confident, a kind of a hyper alert state. They seek to complete things. They seek to kind of achieve these ideas which are in their head, whether it's a fight or whatever else. But actually, that's a really extreme example, but you need a good amount of dopamine internally to be able to push through when things are particularly difficult. Serotonin, for example. So if you have a balanced amount of serotonin, it means that you will be able to, what's the best way to say this? You'll be able to deal with the kind of the pain of being able to push through. So if you have a lack of serotonin, that's often when we become very, very stressed and we're not able to relax. And actually, you might do a short amount of work, burn out, and then be put off by that whole thing altogether. So the balance of those two in the first instance is really, really important. In terms of sort of increasing those or balancing those, it's a very delicate thing, because everything that you do on a day-to-day basis fundamentally has kind of its individual taxonomy on these neurochemicals. So whether it's watching television or gaming, for example, if you're doing that, you're releasing a lot of dopamine, which means that when it comes to actually doing work, you're going to be fried for that. When it comes to particularly stressful environments, or if you have a stressful relationship, for example, it's going to be taking up a lot of serotonin for that. So it means that, again, you're going to find pushing through on things very, very difficult. So that's kind of lifestyle and how that can be affected by that. Dopamine, if you go for a run 40, 50 minutes, for example, that produces a lot of dopamine in the hippocampus. You get neurogenesis taking place, which means that you get new neurons created in the brain. And that is probably one of the most positive things you can have to increase executive function, like hands down, outright. There's a large debate at the moment about nutrition and the direct impact that has on availability of these neurochemistry in your brain. The key thing is, without wanting to go into things in too much detail, you're having a balanced diet. You've got a good amount of protein, good amount of carbohydrates. You're not drinking too much. You're not poisoning yourself. You don't have large amounts of toxins flowing through you. Without going into it in too much detail, essentially. Unfortunately, I think the way that often lifestyles are set up, if you have particularly bad habits which are detrimental to you, they're leaching your neurochemistry. They're creating a bias, which means it's very difficult then to establish new habits, very difficult to point yourself in the right direction from the get-go.
Yeah, because if you're watching porn, jerking off, losing dopamine, playing games, losing dopamine, reacting to every ping and response on your smartphone, losing dopamine, there's not a lot of things left. Burnout, depression, not a lot of motivation, less dopamine, and you're like, you're really stuck. So you're in a self-defeating, inflating cycle at that moment.
Yeah, you create a cycle of like immediate gratification to overcome the fact that you're not motivated for your long-term goals. So it closes that motivation cycle down. But that cycle of motivation or reward, as it were, that kind of internal reward cycle, if it's very tight, so if you have many addictions, for example, if that's particularly tight, then you're not going to be able to escape for that long-term goal. It's going to become quite difficult potentially. So, I mean, things like, I don't know if you're probably aware of nootropics, for example. So rather than looking at like the hardcore nootropics, like you look at amino acids, so something like L-tyrosine, for example. L-tyrosine is one of the building blocks for dopamine. So if you take on board a good amount of L-tyrosine, it's more likely that you'll be able to break an addiction after that, with that balanced neurochemistry than perhaps with just willpower alone.
And it's also just like you said, you can optimize it a bit with nootropics or with your food, which is definitely essential, but it's also arranging your environment or cutting out stuff that there's less chance of you being exposed to potential dopamine depleters that are not serving you.
Yeah, definitely. I think the company that you keep fundamentally either like rewards you for doing those activities or not. So what I mean by that is if you've got a good social circle around you that helps you to kind of move away from those kind of potentially detrimental habits, then that's probably the most positive thing for you. I think a lot of young people fall into the trap of having kind of online communities which are so accessible that actually that in itself is just like sapping away at your dopamine even before you've kind of like gone out into the real world.
Yeah, and we think we're so evolved and all from the prefrontal cortex and logical decisions, but all these pings and notifications are actually triggering our ancient brain system of survival or danger or something new and novelty is like, wow, fantastic, and it's hard to say no to because it's so primal and so instinctive.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like we haven't as much evolved as much as we think we have.
What are clients you work with struggling the most?
So at the moment, I've got a cohort of 30 students that I'm working with. And those students, so the first thing we do is we look at what is known as the first class mindset. So that goes through the mindset which is required to kind of set the foundations for academic success. A lot of the things in there, particularly where social life is concerned, is, are the people around you actually supporting you or kind of dragging you down? And it's just getting them to be very aware about the impact of the company that they keep at that level. The second thing really is actually when we look at nutrition, for example, because a lot of young people in some cases they're either restricted financially or they're restricted potentially by their parents who have these beliefs about cooking and what they should and shouldn't have. That can actually be quite a big barrier to overcome. So that's actually very difficult as well. I think really a lot of the young people are just so heavily affected by the counterculture. They establish these habits via the counterculture rather than establishing these habits which are fully conducive to success.
And also, I mean, your brain and your personality is a bit evolved to the influences and all the stimuli you had, and we have way more stimuli now than in the past. So the senses are a bit overloaded, or they're grown up by always reacting to things, while maybe our generation was a bit in between. I mean, social media were just up and coming, but a huge part of our adolescence was still playing a park, playing soccer, and I didn't have a smartphone until I was 18. So it's a bit different how I was primed and what decisions I can make. And I can compare it with the past that was like less with technology, although still a problem for me, but I was kind of like stuck in between, you know?
I think, without putting my foot in it, I think, young males in particular have a hard time. We've seen that young males in school just don't do as well as females, and that's written on the walls. That's a complete fact. And I think actually one of the reasons for that is that there is this. I don't think society lends itself particularly well to young males. I mean, in terms of sport, they do sport maybe twice a week. They might do some activity outside of school, but in a lot of cases they are potentially sedentary. And then particularly if you come from a background that doesn't value sport or that sort of stuff, these young males are growing up, they're not really accessing their full hormonal range. Their testosterone is particularly low. They're not releasing growth hormone. And that then, funnily enough, presents itself with this ADHD, this inattentiveness, the inability to concentrate, sustain motivation, and that I think is a massive thing which needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's a taboo topic. All that men grow more on average through rough and tumble play and need some father figures, and sometimes they like assertiveness and competitiveness. It is a bit of a feminization of education, which partly was good to, you know, have respect for everyone and make it more soft. But sometimes men, they need a little bit of competitiveness, assertiveness, you know, like rough and tumble play without excluding people. But that's sometimes what we like, but it's being seen as negative, you know, and that's why that's why men also have it difficult in education, because often they're more assertive or a bit different and less passive, you know, and it's not being respected so much as like how women behave themselves in education, let's say. And
But I think, from an evolutionary perspective, biological perspective, there's no longer a need to kind of compete for survival, if that makes sense. So, at school, whereas, years ago you may have had the need to be engaged was just innate. You were constantly engaged because you were constantly looking out for things which are either going to help or hinder you. That's less so. We take away that risk. We take away that need to be engaged at that level. And females, females in school, they're just constantly looking out for mates, essentially. So, they're engaged. Their maternal purposes are still firing up. Those evolutionary purposes are still there. Males, not so much.
yeah, it's one of the tragedies, man, about the many difficult issues young men face in today's society, and they don't have any voice to talk about things, because sometimes it's seen as if a man has a bad results or a boy, it's his fault. If the woman has bad results, it's the teacher. There's always like responsibility within the men, and then sometimes the victimhood between women, which in the past maybe was the case, and how feminism used to be. But now there's not a lot of voice for the problems of young men. And if they're being talked about, it's like it's the problem of the young boys themselves, or they have to be more like women. But men are still men and women are still women, and people can choose who they want to be. But the answer to the problem of men and masculinity is not just be more like women. Some parts of women are okay, but some parts of men are also fine and typically more masculine, and they need to be expressed in a respectful way, of course. But if they're not expressed, maybe they turn up in like addictions, game addiction, porn addiction, like shame, guilt, because they have no play or they can't talk about it, that's a shame by itself, I feel.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with you in that. There's a big movement forwards in the UK, the championing of mental health. We've got Prince, it's not Prince Harry, Prince. Yeah, one of the princes is now championing. I think it's Heads Together as a serious mental health thing. It's particularly highlighting the lack of expression for that avenue in males.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit ironic. The biggest men's rights activists that are being listened to are women online because they are being taken serious. And when a man does it, he's like a sexist or a misogynist. Well, it's not anti-women; it's just pro-men. But it's a bit funny that the big men's rights activists like Karen Strawn, Camille Paglia, and Christine Hoff Sommers are all like women, and they're being listened to. Suppose a student has problems studying. Do you have some productivity tips, or how should he structure his day or week or his study material?
Okay. So I think the key thing for me is just understanding where those problems potentially are coming from. Is it biological? Is it that they generally just don't have the kind of the minerals for motivation? Is it environmental? So are there particular stresses taking place, or is it just the strategy isn't in place? I mean, strategy is far more easy to deal with in terms of structure. Um, if a kid's at school or if a kid's at university, that's kind of slightly different. But for school, for all intensive purposes, they need to ensure they're hitting all those lessons, and then they need a timetable essentially that guides them through things across their week. So immediately when they get home from school, chill out. I think reduce those stress levels, and then they need to hit a couple of hours. So an hour, a break, an hour, some food in between, and then done. I don't think any more than two hours a day is actually productive. On top of the full day they've done. And in fact, my advice is that work no longer than an hour at a time. It's for them, it's just not possible. It's just not feasible. In fact, a lot of people can't surpass half an hour, 45 minutes at that point. So the key thing is really reducing those stresses, because you're stressed, that reduces your executive function, so it's counterproductive. And a lot of kids that we see out of a 7-week term, for example, week 6, week 7, they're fried. They literally have no impulse control whatsoever. They're completely fried, and that's a massive problem. So yeah, that in itself is important. Balance, really, fundamentally, and a good dose of reading. Like, if kids just don't read, they literally don't read. And this battle for literacy at the moment is not being won because we're focusing on the craftsmanship, and we're focusing on the kind of the very fine details of how to write, whereas people don't have a context to base this literary imagination in. They're not reading a wide range of literature. They're not modeling that at all, and it's a problem.
Can everybody be a marathon runner when it comes to studying, or some people like sprinters? When the exams are approaching, they just pump out like 8 hours a day, and they do it like a month and a half, and then they feel the burn, and they finally get into action.
I think some people, the stress gets to them, like, if particularly people that don't deal very well with stress. So if they're not living a particularly active lifestyle, then they're not used to having that stress. If they're not practiced overcoming that stress, then actually it's these people who burn out the quickest. They'll put in some very last minute revision as a result of the impending stresses, but it's those people who do things consistently that work the best, that produce the best results. Those people that go away and they'll do that a couple of hours a day consistently, they absolutely smash it. Their retention is fantastic. Their ability to learn and apply themselves is excellent, and actually they don't feel the stress so much when it comes down to it. Just practicing, fundamentally being exposed to stress. It very much is like going to the gym and putting yourself through your paces. Are you practicing that mental gym work at home when you get home?
Why do you think those students need to feel stress?
Um,
before moving into action?
well, different. I mean, people are motivated by different things. I mean, procrastination. Some people need to feel that stress before they can work. If they're not intrinsically motivated by something, or if they don't find something interested, then they will tough it out as long as possible. They will find every means possible. The creative brain will become the most creative thing when you've got a piece of work to do that you don't want to do. You'll start cleaning your shoes, for example, which you've not cleaned in a couple of years. Everyone will find that internal stress for them is more of a driver when it becomes more painful, and then that will drive them. Whereas those people who are intrinsically motivated fight or have an innate passion in something, that's what overcomes that procrastination.
How can people notice or find out that they're stressed? Or what are some signs of being stressed that people can notice?
Um, I think so. Having having seen all ranges of stress, really, for me, I think the key indicator is an inability to apply yourself when you need to. So, or difficulty to apply yourself when you need to, and that might even just be you might be fresh as a daisy. You might have come back off holiday, but you go to start a task and actually you can't start it because you're feeling stressed, and that is because you don't have the strategy to be able to achieve that yet. So you can annihilate that stress or that anxiety by developing the strategy, planning things out, and sorting things out. That's just relieving your nervous system from the impending danger, essentially, of failing because you don't know what you're going to do.
You talked a bit about how you could prevent stress, but what can somebody do when they're stressed?
Um, so one of the things that has always boded well for me when I've been particularly stressed is sensory deprivation. So I've put myself in a dark room, put some headphones on, and literally close my eyes. But that's when things get particularly stressful. I think exercise for me has always been the big winner, and a carbohydrate heavy meal. Um, I think one thing to warn about though is exercise to the point of too much stress. Exercise does also create stress, and I think just some light, steady exercise that doesn't burn yourself out is absolutely perfect, because you're moving that cortisol around, you're releasing those endorphins, and that will combat that immediately. Also, I think that one of the key things to overcome that stress as well is acknowledging your stress and doing the work that you need to. Your pain fundamentally is signposting you to what you need to do, and you need to acknowledge that. And people who ignore that and allow it to grow, that's where the problems start to creep in. You have to acknowledge that in some cases things can be painful, they can be difficult, and actually it's through overcoming those, slaying that dragon, as it were, that you overcome that stress in the interim.
What is something that you still struggle with or sometimes are stressed about?
um Something for me, um I I often find myself pushing too hard. So I wouldn't. Well, actually, I think I've been close to burnout many times, and that's just through being so motivated to achieve at the best of my ability that you become stressed out, and it's paradoxical. But actually, I'm probably my own worst enemy when it comes down to. But I work very hard for 7-8 weeks at a time, and then I'll have some downtime. So I know that there's an end in sight, and it's not something that's chronic or long term persistent.
And because when you're a high performance coach, you can keep on pushing your boundary and perform more. So that boundary just keeps on shifting until oh, I went past my limit.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a firm believer that you don't know where your limits are until you've passed them. Which has always been, I guess, relatively reassuring to know that when things are potentially that painful, that's where a massive amount of personal growth and development is taking place. And I often thrive in those situations where things are quite uncomfortable. I find that the most challenging, and I find that you learn far more about yourself in those situations than you could ever ask from reading a book or just being in your comfort zone.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing that I realized. A lot of people say get outside of your comfort zone, but when your new comfort zone becomes your uncomfortable zone, that means that becoming comfortable is your uncomfortable zone. So for people who are so much outside of their comfort zone, there's also some benefit for those people to just chill and relax, because that's their new getting outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah, totally. I used to find switching off one of the most difficult things, and actually that's kind of been that's been the best learning curve for me. Really, has been okay. How do I relax quickly? It's okay to actually tune out and sit and watch like an episode on Netflix for, that's okay. The entrepreneur's curse is this, environment of you must be going every single time. Like Gary Vaynerchuk, I really enjoy what he has to say, but I wouldn't want to be him. Wouldn't want to be him. He says there's 24 hours in a day, there's 6 hours to sleep. What are you doing for the rest of those 18 hours? Like, insinuating that you must be working.
Well, that's his path, and that can be useful for him. But what I wonder, but that's just me, he has children. If he works 16 hours a day and he's only sleeping 8 hours, where is the time with his children or with his wife? I mean, I like somebody who's successful, but somebody successful also has a fulfilling existence. And when his one pillar of satisfaction is his work, that means it's less balanced. So I like people who do the hustle. Sometimes you need to do it, but I don't look up to people who purely live for just working and 16 hours a day. Plus, it's not the most productive lifestyle to have, because me as a productivity coach, 4 hours of really deep work and focused attention can get like 60% of your work done, and then you can put in more work. But if you have to sacrifice social relationships, intimate relationships, your health, traveling, spirituality, I mean, then I'd rather make a little bit less money but still have enough energy to make an impact and be an inspiration, and not have my whole gratification based on one pillar in my life.
Yeah, I think often we portray like work as quite a black and white thing, as if it's like two-dimensional. But actually, through I wouldn't be lying if I said that in trying to find a balance, I've really annoyed my family, for example, through having that very, what is it, a sort of unrelenting, unforgiving mentality about achievement. I'm very lucky that at the moment I've got a fantastic girlfriend who's very understanding. She's a high performer too, but in the same vein, there are periods of time where both of us work incredibly hard, and actually, the quality of the time that we spend together, is diminished by how fried or burnt out we potentially are. So it's about quality of time, quality of existence.
Awesome. Yeah, Nestor Perel also talks about it, that we bring our best to our clients and our work, and then we leave the leftovers at home. But that's a bit of a pity when you provide such a service to the world, but to the most closest to us, we don't provide the same service, or to ourselves.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the sweet spot, really, isn't it? Like, how can you maximize your impact whilst retaining some for yourself? What is it you can do to ensure that other people are very much feeling the same way as you do? How can you transfer your energy, essentially?
Now, I'm also big into habits. Are there some essential habits that you have, or some bad habits that you quit and that really improved your life, or that you need to have a good day?
Biggest habit for me has always been I would identify the key thing which I need to do every day, regardless. So even if it was, so if it was, say, reading a journal article, for example, I would do that every day. I would, some days I would do two. I would always do one at least. I'd always read at least half an hour, for example, but I was always do that. And that was more of a statement to myself than anything else. So just constantly chipping away, constantly rolling that snowball, because long term, that's where it pays off. In terms of sort of like habits to overcome, I think where I am at the moment, because I'm enjoying what I'm doing, I'm very keen to take that experience on and to help people, and actually it's just a case of saying no, and that habit of kind of saying yes to everything just erodes your boundaries. And whilst I enjoy the challenge. I enjoy that. Actually, it's something that over a period of time is like, well, I need to say no more and create a more positive habit of saying no and maintaining that energy. So following on from what we are talking about earlier.
Do you have any morning routine or evening routine or fixed things that happen during the day or how you set up the day?
So that's an interesting one actually. Because for me in the mornings, if if I'm particularly stressed, sometimes I find it difficult to wake up. So I actually one thing that I do is I'll cook up all my food for the week, for the start of the week, and I'll take it to work with me. Or I'll ensure that I've got food around. So that means that when I wake up in the morning, I can just focus on, just waking up slowly. I wake up to a light rather than an alarm, 9 times out of 10. And that light means that the first thing that you have in the morning isn't a stress response, because you're naturally meant to wake up to light. So that's been a massive positive shift. I take my time over getting up, shower, wash, and so on and so forth. And then what I'll do, I'll check in with my goals, as it were, and then I will head off to work. So, every morning I've got a vision board essentially in front of me that reminds me of what it is that I'm doing, keeps me focused on that. I'm not one for sort of cold showers. I'm not one for, I'm not one. Actually, I have done gratitude for quite a period of time, but that's not something that I explicitly do in the mornings, for example, as part of a ritual.
Is there any habit you would still like to try out once, or that seems interesting for you?
So any habits, I think if I was self-employed, so if I was working for myself, the benefit of a cold shower and the benefit of exercise first thing in the morning is I see as absolutely massive, and that's something that I would like to shift towards. So that's something that I would like to do.
Before I delve into the concluding questions, is there anything that you would still like to share that we haven't talked about yet?
The key thing that I've massively realized through this whole process is the power of language and our own sort of internal dialogue, and that in saying, the words that we use and the meanings that we associate to them don't necessarily translate directly to how you receive them, for example. And what I mean by that, in the context of sort of goal setting, in the context of education, so if you say that a child is worth a 5, or they're a level 5, for example, the beliefs that they hold against that are either going to enable them to achieve that or dismantle them and completely unmotivate them. In the same vein, when we talk about money, when my beliefs about money compared to yours completely different, and they allow you to kind of achieve or not achieve that. And actually, I think that's where the value of education comes in, the exploration of what those singular ideas mean and how you use that, how you apply those ideas moving forwards. And I think that's the most powerful thing that anyone could ever learn, is that they're in charge of the meanings which they associate with that terminology or those ideas.
And it's also tied in with the fixed or growth mindset. When people know that, okay, this is growth. If I put in an effort, I can achieve something. I always was a rebel. So I was like, I'm going to prove you wrong. So I just gotten out of it and saying like, I'm going to do it by myself. But a lot of artists or people who are different or think differently really have a hard time in education, because they feel like I can't achieve it, or I'm judged, or I'm not a talent. And then they never pursue their talent or what they're really good at, or don't go for it, which is a pity.
Yeah, I can see that.
What are some of the resources about peak performance, learning, mindset that was really beneficial in your life and you would invite other people to check out? Mentors, books?
So I'm actually a massive fan of Jim Rohn and Brian Tracy. I think they're kind of the godfathers of personal development. I think they're instrumental. Jim Rohn in particular, because he takes this kind of pastoral, biblical approach, this fables and things. I just loved the storytelling and the way that he set the tone. Brian Tracy also, because of just how clinical he is and very black and white. I think they're absolutely amazing. So their earlier stuff like Eat That Frog, and the time management side of things, I think is fantastic. The Master Key System by Charles Harnell, I think, was an incredible piece of work in terms of unifying philosophy with metaphysics and starting to really break down the laws of attraction. I think that was absolutely incredible. And then I dare I say anything that kind of Tony Robbins has kind of laid his hands on in terms, and the reason why I say that is just because of how kind of accessible it is for people, because of the way that he presents information, and I think that's absolutely amazing. So there's some fantastic personal development stuff out there, and if people aren't tapping into that, then they absolutely need to, because it's just it's so challenging to be able to apply that stuff. But that's where the real mastery takes place, and that's where the real growth is. And if you can master that stuff, you can master yourself, that self-control, that self-discipline, then that's the real key.
Yeah, if you can use these building blocks, and you saw how I received this, now let's go back and see the essential building blocks and teach it to people so they can learn faster and quicker than I had to learn by myself or discover by myself. That's awesome. Is that something you remind yourself of every day, or a quote that's really important to you?
Something to remind myself of every day. No, there's not something that I remind myself every day. I think fundamentally, I recognize myself as kind of the master of my own destiny, and I recognize the level of accountability and responsibility that I have, not just for my actions, but my thoughts as well. I think that's something that is deeply embedded within me, I think, through the experiences that I've had. And that's something that is massively reassuring to know moving forwards, is that having had these experiences, I'm confident with that approach and that mindset. And that's not necessarily something that I repeat every day, but it's something that I remind myself of very frequently.
What is an event or a person that had the most impact in your life?
So fairly recently, I did a skydive. I jumped out of a plane, and that for me was massively symbolic in terms of letting go, letting yourself be completely in someone else's hands, acknowledging any fears that you might have, and that was a pretty big game changer, massively so. It had just so many sort of deep metaphors, and the fact that I did it with my girlfriend as well was just such an incredible experience, that we're both going through the same thing at the same time, same emotions, same everything. It was a hugely bonding experience, and I would definitely recommend it.
What would you like people to say about you at your funeral?
That he had an impact on me, I think, is the key thing. And that's something that motivates me more than anything, is that just like being able to shift consciousness, or kind of make things easier for someone, or to bring them out of a point of pain. That is a massive value to me personally.
Last question. When I mention a meaningful and fulfilling life, what does that mean to you?
Meaningful and fulfilling life is, for me, it's balancing selflessness with being selfish, in the sense that you're spending your time doing something purposeful which you enjoy. So you're that learning that you've taken on board, you're spreading that as best as possible. You're reaching as many people as possible, but you're also having fantastic relationships. You're having great time, and that you're able to nurture kind of like your inner self as well. I think that for me is what that means.
All right, Luke, I want to appreciate you for your time and impacting so many students, helping them to be more productive and have a better performance, maybe changing the education system a little bit that way, in future generations. So I want to thank you so much for this chat. If people want to find out more about you and what you do and want to get in contact with you, where can they find out more about you?
So at the moment, we're on www.thestudentmemory.com and www.peaklearningstates.co.uk.
Thanks so much for the podcast, Luke.
Filip, thank you.
Hey, it's Phil from Houte Bootcamps, and I help entrepreneurs and coaches achieve more in less time by boosting their productivity and sales. If you would also like to get on a free consultation call with me, you should go to habitbootcamps.com/getproductive or habitbootcamps.com/getsales. And if you like my podcast, don't forget to subscribe and check out my Habit Bootcamp's Facebook group and YouTube channel for some more awesome content.